Today we're going to be talking about some financial topics, so I wanted to share this quick disclaimer. The information provided here is for general purposes only and should not be construed as legal, tax, or financial advice. You should consult a qualified tax professional or advisor to address your specific needs and circumstances. Any actions you take based on the information provided are done at your own discretion and risk. So let's dive right in. Today we have Pranav, or as we know him, PT, a good friend of ours. We went to college together at Berkeley, and he got his MBA at Harvard Business School. Recently, we learned about a fascinating personal investing project he's embarked on: short-term rentals, and it's a real estate investing project. And we wanted to catch up with him about it. PT, welcome to the pod, man.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me. Part two.
Yeah, and yeah, so we've been talking about real estate investments, in our little group. We have a little investing group for a long time, but none of us really took the plunge until you did just a short while ago. So maybe you can tell us a little bit of the origin story and what you've been working on.
Yeah, sounds great. So I think my interest in short-term rentals really comes from a recent priority of ours, which was to better optimize our tax exposure. So what does that really mean? I think growing up, I didn't really spend a lot of time thinking about taxes. Over the years, I think I and many of our friends and family were fortunate enough to have career growth, meet a partner, have a family, invest, hopefully have a return on those investments. And when you're going through all of these life events, you're not really thinking about taxes. I don't think it's necessarily normal to do so. But I think over the last few years, it's become more and more of a priority. And I remember thinking back to kind of my early days at Indigo and talking to one of my managers who was telling me that through various tax strategies that he's found and put in place, he's able to kind of lower his effective tax rate to the low teens. Obviously, that's pretty low, especially when you're an executive. And I think that was the first time that I was intrigued about tax strategies in general. And when I asked him about what his tax strategy was, it really centered around real estate, farmland, and equipment. And I didn't have any of those things at that time point, so I kind of just brushed it off. I'd say, maybe a few years ago when I was in business school, I remember probably reading a case or talking to some buddies about assets and depreciation, and it kind of re-triggered this conversation that I had with my manager at Indigo. And that was complemented by a colleague on the job who said that she was working on short-term rentals and she was able to kind of reduce her effective tax rate as a result. And that just really got me interested. So I started doing a bunch of reading, doing a bunch of interviews with CPAs and trying to just understand what a potential strategy could be around short-term rentals and how that could kind of help us from a tax perspective. So I think in the last year, I definitely have gained confidence around that strategy and think that you can leverage short-term rentals, specifically bonus depreciation with short-term rentals, to create a paper loss and use that paper loss to offset your W-2 income, which would lower your effective tax rate. And I'll jump into all of those details in a little bit, but the short of it.
Maybe you could take a quick step back and just explain to people listening, what is a short-term rental, and what is it all about?
Yeah, let me take a step back. So a short-term rental is defined by the IRS as a rental property that has an average length of stay of under 7 days. So
Okay.
think of it as like an Airbnb or VRBO, Booking.com, a house that or apartment, condo, whatever that you purchase, you put up on one of those platforms and you rent it throughout the course of the year. And there's some other background that I think that would be relevant here too. When the IRS looks at income, they look at two different types of income: W-2 income and 1099 income. W-2 income is usually for salaried employees, and in my mind, at least, it's pretty inflexible. 1099 income is income that you can generate if you're an independent contractor or a consultant, and I think it's more flexible because you can, deduct expenses off of that kind of income. With W-2 income, there's something called a standard deduction that most people take. It's somewhere, around $27,000. And that's, you take your base salary, you deduct it by $27,000, and that's what you pay taxes on. Now, on the 1099 side, you can kind of itemize expenses that you have and then net that against your gross to get ideally a smaller number that you're paying taxes on. So that's kind of one piece of background, W-2 income versus 1099. There's also the classification of income as active or passive. So if you have a W-2 or a salary job, like many of us do, it's considered W-2 income. At the end of the year, you'll get a W-2 tax form and you file that with the IRS. And they automatically deduct your taxes on a paycheck by paycheck basis. That's generally considered your active income. Anything else that you do on the side is considered passive. And there's another law that if you generate losses with your passive income, the maximum loss that you can take in any given year is $3,000. So let's say you have a W-2 job, you're working at a company, and you start a side business. Unfortunately, that side business doesn't do well and it loses $50,000 in a year. Because that is passive income, you can only take $3,000 of that $50,000 loss and offset it against whatever your W-2 income was. So the passive and the active thing are really important when you're thinking about real estate strategies, because if there's a way that you can turn the passive income into active, you can then net it against each other to hopefully produce a lower number that you're going to pay taxes on. But did that make sense? Like the kind of different types of income and passive and active classification?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to me. I think one thing that when I do my taxes, I see a lot is okay, you have a W-2, but some people take the standard deduction and some people, I think they itemize within their W-2, right? So, um, is the active versus passive question really the thing that's preventing you from doing like the further itemization inside of the W-2? And you need to kind of find unlocks to do that itemization inside the W-2. And then how are people doing that itemization within their W-2 right now?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Arv. So not necessarily. The active and passive thing is not relevant to itemizing deductions on your W-2. Any of us could take itemized deductions on a W-2, but what you would need is, a list of all of your expenses that you incurred as a part of your work, right? These are not day-to-day expenses that you're having. They have to be documented. You have to have receipts that you incurred these expenses on behalf of whatever your job was,
As part of the active income job.
as part of the active
They
income
can't be
job.
part of the side project thing.
It
That's
can't
the
be
thing.
side of this.
Got it. Okay. Okay.
Exactly. Um,
Okay. Okay.
and if that's the case, and you think that you have more than $27,000 worth of expenses for your active income job, then you should document it. You can work with your tax professional or whoever prepares taxes to take more than the standard deduction. I don't know the percentages here, but I would say 80 to 90+% of people just take the standard deduction because it's kind of what the IRS has come up with as an average of what people would incur for their day-to-day jobs.
Mm. And then in the other case you mentioned, you have the 47K, let's say left over from that 50K loss.
Yeah.
Is that just like gone? That's that 47K. I lost it. It has now evaporated from my ability to remove it from my taxes. Like it's just lost.
It's not lost, thankfully, but the $3,000 threshold doesn't go away. So it just rolls over in
Got it.
$3,000
Okay.
increments
Okay.
from
So
year
you
to
might just
year.
die with like tens of
Yeah,
K left over on your incremental rollover.
right.
Got it. Okay. So as you're exploring strategies, like this is a clear thing where you're trying to convert this W-2 income, or you're trying to reduce the burden on this W-2 income through strategies like the short-term rentals. Did you explore like the whole space of strategies people use to do this to make their passive income more active and reduce that burden and then come to short terms? Or is this just one of the few ways that exist and there's actually not that many explorations? Like how'd you land on short term within this space?
Yeah, I think, over the years, I've always been interested in it. As I mentioned, a colleague of mine mentioned the asset class of short-term rentals. And as I was doing diligence on it, I think it's one of the few ways that W-2 earners can help offset their, tax liability in that there are some benefits to short-term rentals that allow you to turn that passive income into active income. And I'll go into those details. But again, it kind of really just solidifies this strategy around buying a short-term rental, trying to create a paper loss with that short-term rental with something called bonus depreciation, and then using that paper loss to offset your W-2 income to have a lower tax base, basically.
Maybe you can just get into it now. Maybe you can do the math on, like 100K investment, what it would look like in terms of paper depreciation, how it would take your costs down, and then we can dive into the
Yeah,
details after.
totally. Can I give you one more piece of background before
Oh,
I?
sure. Yeah, totally. Yeah, sorry.
So the other piece of background that's really, really important here is something called a real estate professional. So if you're not a real estate professional, all the rules that we talked about apply. You cannot apply passive, losses against active income. Now, if you have this status from the IRS's perspective called real estate professional, that's what enables you to turn this passive income over here into active, and it allows the, netting against your other income. So, the golden chip, if you will, is having this real estate professional status. Now, going back to short-term rentals, the reason why I chose short-term rentals as the asset class is the bar to be a real estate professional with the short-term rental, in my opinion, is lower than the bar to be a real estate professional if you have a medium or long-term rental. And the bar is essentially, if you have a W-2 job and you have a property that you're renting out, with a greater than 7 days average length of stay, monthly or yearly, the threshold to get the real estate professional status is you have to spend more hours on that real estate project than your W-2 job. Now, that's kind of unlikely, right? You're not going to spend more than 2,000 hours managing a single family home that you typically spend on your W-2 job. Now, the benefit here is really around with short-term rentals, the threshold is much lower. So there's a bunch of qualifications that you can meet to get this real estate professional status with short-term rentals, but the most common are, one, you're the person who's spending the most hours managing that business. So you have to put in more time than the cleaners or the handyman or whomever else is helping you manage that business. You have to be quantitatively spending more time. Or you have to spend more than 100 hours a year managing that project. So that threshold is very different than, the 2,000 hour requirement to exceed a W-2 job on the long-term side. So I think getting that real estate professional status is key, and in my opinion, is much more doable with short-term rentals, which is really what pointed the tax strategy towards that asset class. So kind of now, right, just putting some numbers on things. Let's say that you earn $100,000 on your W-2 job, right? You have a salary job and you're earning $100K a year. Let's say that you've identified a property that you want to purchase for $100,000 to keep numbers, even. Now, typically the way depreciation works, right? Depreciation is the loss in value of an asset over time. So usually rental properties have a useful life of 39 years. So you would take the $100,000 purchase price, divide it by 39, and that's how much you can write off in depreciation every year that the house is losing in value. Now, again, around short-term rentals, there's a couple of tax advantages where you can accelerate that depreciation. It's called bonus depreciation, which basically allows you to take more than 1/39 depreciation in the first year. And over the last 15 or so years before 2023, it was 100%, meaning you could take 100% depreciation in year one. And what does that do for you, right? Like you can literally write off the entire value of the home in year one. So let's just say for, basic math, the business, it doesn't produce any income. All of your revenue offsets your expenses and you make $0. At the end of the first year now, what this bonus depreciation allows you to do is on paper, write off another $100,000, which is that 100%, to get to minus 100K. And then that minus 100K can be used to offset your W-2 job, which in this case we said was 100,000. So it basically makes your tax base zero in that case. Now that's an extreme example. You probably never would buy, a home that's equivalent to your base salary. But at the end of the day, I think that this tax advantage exists, and it exists because of the ability to claim real estate professional status with a short-term rental.
Yeah, actually, one thing I would love to dive a little bit deeper on is why do you think these rules exist? Like, why is it that for short-term rentals specifically, the way that the tax codes work, you know, incentivizes short-term rentals in this way?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think primarily, I think tax code is written and updated to incentivize certain behaviors by us as consumers. And I think in this case, they want to incentivize, the influx of short-term rentals in these various communities to promote tourism or other, types of visits. But I think generally, um, these things do change over time. So, for example, the 100% example that I mentioned, that was only until 2023. And then every year thereafter, it's decreasing by 20%. So in 2023, it was 80%. In 2024, this year, it's 60%. So on the property that we purchased, we were only able to take 60% bonus depreciation. And I say only, but that is, a large number. And next year it's supposed to go down to 40 and eventually be phased out. Now I have been reading a lot of forums and kind of just looking at various posts, and I do think that all signs point to this regulation coming back. So it actually will go back to 100% bonus depreciation with short-term rentals. I think that'll happen as early as next year. But to answer your question, Vivek, I think it is to promote behavior around the increase of short-term rental properties in Pacific communities.
Yeah, and I mean, you've said this in the past, but you had to put money and time and effort into fixing the house up, into making it better. You're pouring, more money into the community in that sense to make that house ready to rent. And so I
Right.
can see why they're incentivizing that. You see a lot of sort of houses that are going unused and unfinished in old neighborhoods, and then you want money to come into the community. How do you get that? They've kind of chosen this as one of the avenues to get more money to come in.
And also, maybe talk a little bit about where you ended up purchasing and how does where you end up purchasing the property impact things? Like, does it matter?
Yeah, I think where matters a lot, mostly because about the regulations around short-term rental. So all states in the United States are not equivalent in terms of their short-term regulations. A state like California, for example, it's not impossible. There's Airbnbs all over California, but I would say it's more difficult to get the appropriate permits and licenses to be able to legally put a property up as a short-term rental. So my strategy was really focused on finding an area that had more lax short-term rental laws or more friendly short-term rental laws. So we were actually honed it down between the Smoky Mountains in Tennessee, which is a very high tourist destination that has friendly regulation, in Arizona, Tempe, Arizona specifically. And we ended up choosing Tempe, Arizona, because we also felt that it would be a place that we would visit more often than the Smoky Mountains in Tennessee. Um,
And do you plan to go and live or stay in the property every so often, or?
I think so. I think that was the primary driver of us pushing towards Arizona versus Tennessee. But we're actually going there next week for a bit. I'm going there with some buddies in January. So I think it'll kind of dual as a side business for us that helps us with our tax liability. But at the same time, it's kind of like a cool vacation spot that we can hit up whenever.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that occurred to me is that for people who live in on the coasts or in areas where real estate is really really expensive, um, and maybe you don't have the opportunity to buy your own home because it's too expensive, you're priced out, or something like that. Uh, this could be a good opportunity. This type of opportunity could be a good one to not only offset some of your tax burden and make a real estate investment, but also to become a homeowner.
Totally. And this was our first time buying a home, a Lakeland mine, and definitely learned a lot about the home buying process. I think it also made me more confident that when we do purchase our primary home, I'll be that much, more prepared and kind of ready for all aspects of what buying a home requires. And I think, the general process again is what we did was we started a business, we started an LLC, because for the W-2 1099 reasons we were mentioning earlier, we wanted to be able to deduct expenses against the LLC. Um, we used that LLC to purchase a property. So we spoke to an agent who was knowledgeable in the Tempe area and knowledgeable around short-term rentals. We spoke to a lender and secured a loan. We ended up going with a very specific loan called a debt service coverage ratio loan that is specific to rentals, and doesn't necessarily require a personal guarantee. And that was important to me very specifically in that I don't want this business to impact our ability to get a primary loan. So once we got that loan in place, we found a property that we liked, we got the offer accepted. Then kind of the hard work really started. I initially thought that this could be kind of like a set it and forget it type strategy and just reap the benefits, but it's really not that. It kind of requires active management. The first month, I'd say we worked the hardest. Aleki and I both went out there for a couple of weeks apiece and furnished the place, built relationships on the grounds with cleaners and handymen and pool folks and all that stuff.
You guys have a pool?
We have a pool, yeah. There's a pool in the back. And just like operationalized it. It took about a good solid 4 or 5 weeks to do that. We then put it up on Airbnb. I'm managing it by myself right now, which isn't too difficult on an ongoing basis. It's coordinating stays and cleaners and then dealing with any issues that pop up.
Let's be clear, it's pretty hard because you're a real estate professional and you're spending a ton of time on it, right?
That's right. I do think in that regard, like the hour threshold, the 100-hour threshold that I mentioned, we definitely achieved it just in the setup of the property because like we were literally there for 4 weeks straight, focusing on the property. So I feel like we're good on that regard. But yeah, we learned a lot. I ended up going with this channel manager called Hospitable, which is an application that you can use that will help you manage different channels. So we also put it up on VRBO and Booking.com, which increased the occupancy. At the end of the day, what we want to make sure, right, is this business doesn't lose money. So we want to make enough money with our occupancy and guests to offset the loan payment and any other expenses that we incur on a monthly basis, like utilities and pool cleanings and things like that. And so long as that's the case, I think the strategy is upheld. And then you can leverage that bonus depreciation in year one to generate a negative paper loss, offset that against your W-2 income. And for me, I think, I just talked to my CPA earlier this week to kind of check all the boxes and make sure that I've completed everything for 2024. And one of the key elements that I think people often forget is you have to do something called a cost segregation study. And this is also something that I learned as I was going through the process, but it's not enough just to buy the property and claim the depreciation. You have to get a professional to come in and value the different types of assets in the house. So the piping and the electrical components will have a different useful life than furniture and fixtures. So they kind of come and do this analysis and quantify everything for you. That then enables you to take that bonus depreciation. But all the boxes are checked. It seems like it's all going to work out. So I think my strategy going forward will be, to purchase one every year.
Can you talk a little about the leverage aspect of it? Because you got a bank loan. Let's say we go back to the 100K property.
Yeah.
So you would have gotten a bank loan for, let's say, 20K to put 20% down on the property. But you can take 60K depreciation off the first year, right? So you're actually able to depreciate on the full value of the property, even though you didn't buy the property outright. 80% is owned by the bank at that time, right?
That's exactly.
I guess actually in some ways 100% owned by the bank because they gave you the loan for the. Do they give you the down also? Like how does the loan work to the LLC?
So the loan to the LLC is very typical to a traditional loan. So you put down a down payment. We ended up putting down 20%, the traditional. Okay. And then the remainder 80, you're just, paying payments to the bank. You own the house, but they would have a lien on it if you don't, make your payments. But
so
yeah,
it's actually reasonable in a way. I think you were sort of saying before that, if you had 100K income, you might not buy a 100K house, but it's actually in some ways it's feasible that you could put 20K into the loan, get 80K from the bank, actually buy a property that was considerably close to your W-2 income value and then depreciate, 60% of that off the first year and then reduce your burden pretty significantly. Maybe in the past, even 100% would have been possible. Am I doing the math right there?
I think you are. I think you
Okay.
are. I think it is a meaningful strategy, especially if you have significant W-2 income to offset some of that. And this is, completely above board and by the tax code and tried and true. I just think it's like not very well known. Even like CPAs that I was speaking with, the key question, if you're interviewing a CPA and you want to know whether or not to work with them around short-term rentals, is do you understand material participation? And if they say yes, then I think they're knowledgeable about the space and you continue the discussion. If they say no, they're probably not the right person for you.
What is material participation?
Material participation is that threshold that is required to achieve real estate professional status. So in a short-term rental, it's either 100 hours or
Mm.
you're putting in the most hours out of anyone. That's material participation. In a long-term rental, it's much more. But yeah, it's not even super well known among CPAs. I probably spoke to a dozen CPAs or so over the last year. I would say 2 or 3 out of them were really familiar with it. The others definitely went back, did their readings, and became familiar with it. But I wanted to work with someone who had done this before, so I ended up choosing a CPA who does this for a living, basically.
Is it
And maybe
100 hours in that first year only, or is it 100 hours every year for that property?
It's 100 hours every year to reach the status, and you have to maintain that status year over year.
So as you go to, you mentioned you're thinking of doing this every year, buying a new place. Are you adding a 100-hour incremental burden for every property, or is it that you have to spend 100 hours across the range of properties you have to get the status?
Yeah, you would have to spend it on each property.
Wow.
oh
Okay. So
really?
that could start to become actually a fairly large job if you had 4 or 5 of these things.
It totally could. At some point, I do think the day-to-day management would have to be outsourced. I think the initial setup and setting up the Airbnb, getting the furniture, getting the vibe and the feel right would take a large component of that 100. So that's
Hmm.
not really what I'm worried about, especially if you buy a new property that year. I think it's more in years 2 and 3 and 4, how do you qualify for that specific property? But I think it's also important to know that in years 2, 3, and 4, you're not taking bonus depreciation anymore on that property.
Hmm.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily need to qualify as a real
Okay.
estate professional for that property. Um,
Yep.
And that's
Yeah,
where
that makes sense.
I think the doing it each year is part of the strategy, because you want to be able to. It's a real estate investing strategy. So over time, you build up a lot of properties, but also in order to write the depreciation off of your W-2 income, you'd have to do a new one each year to be able to take advantage of that benefit. So I guess this is a good time to switch gears a little bit into. It sounds like this is a two-pronged strategy. There's a tax benefit side of things, but
yeah.
there's also, this is just another way to think about investing in real estate in general.
Absolutely. And as I mentioned a couple of times, we had no exposure to real estate. This was our first, home purchase. We don't have a primary home. We're renting right now. And I hadn't invested in any, real estate type equities or anything like that. So I've been thinking over the years that we wanted to get into real estate. And I think it's just a bonus that there's this tax benefit. So if I put it in short, it's really a near-term tax optimization play and a long-term real estate play. I will caveat that like the IRS has thought these things through, right? Like you can't just go ahead, claim the benefit in year 1 and sell in year 2 or year 3. You will get hit with something called depreciation recapture, which is paying taxes on any depreciation that you took. So you alluded to this, Vivek, but a key component of the overall strategy is holding the real estate for the long term.
Yeah, I mean, that's what kind of caught my ear when we were first talking about this is, yeah, I think that the tax benefit is great, but actually you're kind of in some ways becoming like a real estate mogul. Over the course of 10 years, you build up a bunch of properties and in this LLC. And then, assuming that things go well and the markets that you've picked are the right ones, you now have this like pretty established set of assets that you can, do a lot different things with. I mean, someone might decide to go and sell it after 10 years or 15 years of doing this, or something like that as well. And yeah, it just seems like you have a lot of optionality in your side hustle going forward, because you're actually purchasing assets and not, driving for Uber or something.
I think so. And I think it actually could, in the realest sense, go from passive to active. Like it could be your side thing, but once you build enough income, recurring income from this passive, set of real estate properties, it could just be your active. You could, get rid of your W-2 job when you get to that threshold.
Yeah, and you start that flywheel, right? Like as you get more income from that stream, you can use that income to either buy more expensive properties or maybe buy multiple properties in a year and depreciate them, and it really starts to build on itself over time
That's
in a
right.
really cool way. What's the timeline you have with the bank? Is it typically like you have let's say, a 15-year loan with the bank? After 15 years, then do you own entirely? You would own outright, and then you can do whatever you want with that. What's the time period on what Vivs was saying about that?
Yeah, different types of loans, 15-year loans, 30-year loans, 10-year loans. We got a 30-year loan. Ours came with a 5-year arm, and essentially what that means is that the interest rate is fixed for 5 years, and then it will adjust on a variable basis based on the Fed's interest rate. But anyways, it's a 30-year lease. So assuming that we complete that 30-year loan payment, then the house would be 100% ours at the end of that.
And from like a downside risk perspective, like talking about the things you want to try to make sure don't, let's say, don't happen or don't step in, is the biggest risk that, or is one of the biggest risks that you might see a decline in the market that you invest in? You reduce the amount of people that are visiting the house per year and paying you, so you start to take a loss on the property. In that sense, maybe you start to, oh, if you have too many of these and that happens in a systematic way, maybe at some point you're like, we can't pay the loan back. Does that at that point just hit the LLC and the banks will seize the properties? How would that work if, or am I articulating the downside risk
No,
correctly?
you really are. So it's even, I would say, an elevated risk with the specific loan that we took, the DSCR loan, because what the bank is trying to prove in that loan is that you have enough income to offset your loan payment on a monthly basis. So long as
Rental income, right?
rental income,
Okay. Okay.
and it's like short-term rental income. So
Hmm.
the bank will go do their own appraisal and come to their calculation of what they think this property could earn on a monthly basis as an Airbnb.
Mm.
And that has to be equal to or greater than your expected loan payment. And if it is, you qualify for this, DSCR type of loan. The downside risks, I think, are exactly as you laid out. I would say operationally, it's not an easy um, thing to break even on any given month or year, right? Like you really have to, it's a business at the end of the day, and you have to run that business to not lose money. That's the biggest risk. Like if you're continuing to inject your own capital to pay the loan payment or to pay utilities or whatever, it's kind of defeating the purpose of the strategy. So I think you want to buy in a location where you are confident that for whatever number of years, like you're not going to see a decrease in occupancy. But in that downside case where you are not earning enough income to pay the loan payment and you are done kind of personally injecting capital into the business, I think you would be in default of your loan. And then a bunch of not so fun things could happen with the bank, which include seizing the property, and or depending on the loan type, they could come after you personally. Thankfully for this DSCR loan, they can't. And that was a key component of why we got it. But
Mm.
the DSCR loan is in the name of the LLC, which is by design supposed to limit the liability against any personal ramifications to us.
Yeah, and I mean, I think just taking a step back and talking about the inception of this, I remember, I think we were at a bar a year ago, just like chatting about strategies and what we were thinking about. And at that time, you were pretty clear-eyed about it being a fairly low burden,
Yeah.
time-wise and effort-wise. And it seems like you've come a long way and learned that it's really not that straightforward.
It's not, man. I knew that the upfront part was going to be tough. Like I knew that buying a house when I've never bought a house and like furnishing it and getting it up on something that I've never done before is not going to be easy. I did think that all of the ongoing activity I could outsource. And then I became familiar with the material participation law and the requirement to spend a given number of hours per year. So the outsourcing element didn't really work out. Again, so far it hasn't been that bad on an ongoing basis. I think when you stack multiple properties on top of each other, it could get pretty busy, but right now it's doable. But it is a lot of work to get it all set up and then to kind of operationalize the strategy.
Yeah, I mean, and in your day job, you're a finance professional, so there's a lot of these concepts and things that you probably just naturally know or hear about in a
Right.
way that's more nuanced or something like that. Um, and so, like, yeah, I guess my question to you would be: would you recommend this strategy for just like any average person like myself or Arvind to do, or is it something that does require a ton of a ton more legwork and thinking?
So it requires legwork and thinking. I don't want to underplay that because I definitely underplayed that a year ago. But I do think it's an attractive strategy for those who are looking to offset some of their tax liability from specifically W 2 income. There are other strategies for other types of income or other setups, but for ours specifically, where Alekia and I are both primarily W 2 earners, this one's a good strategy. And we're not going to ever kind of get to that zero watermark that we were doing with the hypothetical example. Um, but it does meaningfully help.
It's not going to ever completely wipe out your the losses are never going to completely wipe out your actual income.
Right. We're never going to pay zero tax. I think that's like yeah, a facade. We'll never get to that time point. I think we'll always end up paying into the system and paying some sort of tax. But I think this is a tried and true method that's not super well known that I think will work if interested, but it does require the investment of time.
Although it is wiping out the highest marginal tax dollars in your W-2, right?
Correct.
Because you're not dropping, you're not going to the 37.5% or the 35%, you're going back down. So it's actually like incrementally better in the beginning to wipe off those top dollars from the W-2.
That's true. Yes.
Let's say that just, Vivs and I were looking, we start looking. Like how you mentioned you looked in Tennessee, Arizona, like how would we start? Like, should we just be surveying different state markets? Well, first of all, you mentioned the tax advisor. Find the right tax advisor to talk about with material participation. But from a location perspective, was it primarily like, what's the Venn diagram where I could visit, put 100 hours in, where
Mm-hmm.
I think it's going to be a hot market, where I think I could get a license. I guess that's a big part of it. And then what else is that? Are those the major considerations?
Those are the major considerations. Yes, I would. I'll put in a plug for a company called the Short Term Shop. They're fantastic. They specialize in short term rentals. From an educational perspective, they'll connect you to knowledgeable agents. They operate in like 20 or 30 parts of the US that already have short term friendly regulations and setups and things like that. And if you end up working with the short term shop, they'll kind of give you access to their playbook. So they'll give you a list of cleaners and everyone that you would need on the ground, templates, things like that. But the short term shop truly helped me from kind of when I was interested about it. I worked with one of their agents to find the property, and I worked with their sister mortgage shop called the Mortgage Shop to secure my loan. So I'm a big fan of theirs, and I think they're a great resource for anyone interested.
So yeah,
So Vivs,
short
you
term
calling him
shop,
up?
mortgage shop,
Get him to
shameless
sponsor the
plug, guys. If
podcast.
anyone out there listening from the short
Yeah.
term shop, we're out here
We're
singing
out.
your praises from the rooftops. Please get in touch. You can reach myself or Arvind, and maybe we'll do a deal.
Yeah.
I know the CEO, Avery and Luke. I will
Oh, dude, connect Vivek, man.
Oh yeah,
Make the
be in
deal,
touch.
Vivs.
Actively participating in
Yeah.
tons of conversations about sponsorships and stuff like that. This pod is getting huge, absolutely massive.
Word up, man. Short-term shop would be fortunate.
Awesome, man. Yeah, we have a ton of professionals just like PT listening in. So exact demographic match. Cool. Well, I think PT, it's been so fun learning about this from you. And Arvind and I have actually kind of been riding along on this journey with you for a little while, which is why we wanted to bring you on and kind of tell more people about what this is all about. And it's been fascinating learning about it and hearing your take and perspective. And thanks so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, I
Love the
appreciate you
pod.
joining, man.
I'm a big
Super
fan.
interesting.
Yeah, and invite your friends to the pod. And if you want to shout out any other brands, put us in touch.
Will do.
All right. Talk to y'all later.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.